Chapter 22. A Suit of Armor. "A fine mess you've gotten yourself into, girl." Cedra watched the east gate, her expression unreadable. From the corner of her eye she could see the glint of the general's armor, pacing back and forth before the front lines of the soldiers in the green and brown uniforms of Mora. It seemed like all of her life she had been around soldiers, though she had only just officially become one herself. Her father, brother, and all their friends had served in the king's army and left their impression on her childhood. She appreciated the structured simplicity of a soldier's life, she supposed. When they were not on duty, those without families drank and chased women. Those who did have families drank only slightly less, and reminisced about the times when they used to chase women. They were generally honest, competitive to a fault, and fiercely loyal to their friends. It was commonplace for them to brawl amongst themselves, but if an outsider were to step in and assault the friend they had been ruthlessly abusing just moments before, the two original combatants would become instant allies and turn against the newcomer. It was a phenomenon she had never quite understood. The few female soldiers she had known had been exactly like the men, with the addition of a massive chip on their shoulder from existing in an environment dominated by the opposite sex. Was that the life that lay in store for her as well? A fine mess indeed. They had gotten an early start, and arrived with enough daylight left for the forces to still see as they killed one another. She shivered. No one had ever called her squeamish, but there was likely to be a lot of bloodshed before nightfall. At least the people she had killed while under Grisland's spell had appeared as demons. These would not. That old haunting feeling she had felt in the first days after Jaden, His Highness, she reminded herself, had awoken her, began to resurface when she thought of the spell. Since then, she had come to terms with the knowledge that she may have known some of those she had ruthlessly slain, but it had not been easy. Even if she had not known them, they were likely innocents who had not deserved to die. Considering the circumstances, she knew it was irrational to feel guilt over her actions, but it was there all the same. What is done, and cannot be undone. That was a lesson her grandfather had taught her long ago, and who better to teach that lesson, she supposed, than one who could apparently glimpse the future, but do nothing to change events that had not yet even happened. Her grandfather was a prophet. No, the prophet. The world had gone truly, irrevocably mad. It was an indescribably horrific thing, the spell inflicted on them by one they all trusted. That a wizard would harm anyone should have been inconceivable. They were the protectors of humankind. They had saved humanity in its darkest hours, and guarded against the forces that sought to destroy them since time beyond memory. If the wizards had become fallible, what did that say about the future? If Alamon was gone, who was in charge? If their enemy could slay a being said by many to be the embodiment of the great thoughts, what chance did any of them have? Visible tendrils of her own thoughts and emotions, like translucent little fibers, had frayed and drifted away from the main threads, so she unconsciously wove them back in and regained total focus. It was a little trick her grandfather had helped her with, or at least having someone to speak with about it had helped, though he claimed he could not see his own threads. In fact, she had never met anyone else who could. As a girl, she had been ridiculed when she tried to explain the strange phenomenon to others, so she had eventually stopped trying. After the incident, she had refused to read another's threads again, and she especially refused to follow them back to their source. What she had done to those boys had forever changed her, regardless of whether they deserved it or not. With her focus regained, she set her mind back to the task at hand. She estimated that no more than 800 hostile troops held the east gate, with a lesser contingent guarding the west gate. Ekinroy had raised an eyebrow at the precision of her numbers, but he was beginning to trust her scouting abilities enough that he no longer questioned them, for which she was very grateful. What could she have told him if he had? That she could count the threads of each individual soldier's thoughts hovering above them, feel their exact location even. He would likely have told her to speak with Matthias and remain in her tent for the duration of the siege, and she wouldn't have blamed him. A force so small would normally have no chance against the almost 4,000 under Ekinroy's command, except that holding the gates gave them an extreme tactical advantage. Death would rain down from the towers as they fought to break through. The first gate in the series of 4, which had been all but destroyed when Merc's forces initially assaulted the city, had been replaced by a jumble of wooden carts and crates. Tevius reported that the enemy had doused the wood with oil early in the morning. Assaulting a gate was difficult enough. Assaulting a blockade that would burst into flames as the soldiers tried to clear it, all the while dodging crossbow bolts, would be a nightmare. Enemy riders had attempted to escape the city and flee south a few times now, likely in an effort to reach their commander, Norden Merk, who did not seem to be in Eriden himself. Supposedly, Tevius and his small band had captured or killed all who had tried. The captive messengers had been interrogated and were now held bound and under guard. If even one had managed to slip past and reach the enemy's main force, then all the defenders would have to do was stall until Merk's larger force arrived. The result of being caught between Merk and the East Gate could be catastrophic, especially if the mercenary army managed to circumvent Gustavus without taking substantial losses, and Ekinroy was not about to put his faith in the reports that Merk had been trapped inside Celis. They had no choice, for now, but to trust that Tevius had indeed intercepted every messenger. He was a more than capable soldier, after all, a fine commander even, but the young man had far too much confidence for Sidra's liking. And then there was that odd, fanatical look that would sometimes cause his eyes to glaze, that made her believe him capable of doing something epically stupid on a whim. Even as she thought of him, he passed in front of her and paused, nodding his helmeted head as if to say, "Everything is going perfectly according to the Dragon Slayer's plan. We cannot fail." It was a good plan, she knew. It was daring, brilliant even, and risked as few lives as possible with a high probability of taking the city swiftly. It was a plan that one might expect from a general who was the most famous strategic genius in Alnorda. Still, she was a firm believer in hubris, and Tevius reeked of it. A little humility would do the young man wonders. Situated just out of range of the Ekinroy crossbows, where the clearing path met up with the northern Willowbar road, a scattering of arrows with black feather fletching stuck out of the mud before them like a misshapen row of wind-blown bulrushes. The enemy had tested their range at first, the more undisciplined of them likely thinking they could pick off a few unlucky soldiers. Sidra almost smiled. Any Crysinian who had ever held a longbow could reach nearly to the fourth gate from here. By her estimation, she could have an arrow through the neck of the lookout in the front right tower of the first gate, and one on the way for his companion in the front left tower in the space of about 4 heartbeats, 3 if she rushed it, but she could not guarantee a clean kill at that rate. She could probably take out the lookouts in the remaining towers as well, though at this range it would be hard to pick her spots. One miss would give away the extent of her range, and they would quickly take cover. The general knew of her skill, having seen it firsthand in the practice yard at Mora, and had tasked her, along with a handful of veteran bowmen, to put their skills to use as they saw fit. A few of the archers in the lines, who were not allowed to fire until commanded, grumbled at that, but enough had seen her shoot that they were quickly quieted. One had said something about not being outdone by a girl, and that had earned him an indefinite term of latrine duty. In truth, she could have 2 arrows gone before most of the others could loose 1, and with better accuracy. War was about order in chaos, but a great general knew how to use his best weapons. A weapon. Is that what she was now? Trained by her father and brother at an early age to hunt and fight with knives, she had never followed any of the traditional molds of other girls. While part of her sometimes thought it might be nice to have a family, with a strong, charismatic husband to be proud of and babes to bounce on her knee, she knew that she could never choose such a life over her bow. The object had always fascinated her, so graceful and powerful. As she ran her hand along the curved wood that she had shaped and carved herself, she imagined it was an extension of her own body, mind, and soul. She could feel the same longing in it for revenge against those who had wronged or murdered so many of her people. Her bow was part of her, and her handcrafted arrows were much like threads, she realized. And she controlled threads. "Patience," she soothed those threads which longed for action. Many of her kinsmen would die if they played by the enemy's rules and assaulted the gate in a careless rush. A bell rang out from the royal chapel inside Crysin Castle, cutting through the tense silence, and she breathed a deep sigh of relief as the Ekinroy lookouts turned about in confusion. Tevius motioned everyone to be ready. A small thrill began to rise within her as she notched the special rag-tipped arrow, which had been thoroughly soaked in lamp oil, to the twisted gut string. The sound of flint striking steel sounded beside her, and a young soldier raised a handful of tinder with a small flame hungrily beginning to lick oxygen. Rieger was the man's name, a stocky bully of a fellow who had laughed at her that first day in Mora when she had decided to enlist, and jokingly requested her for a sparring partner. Captain Certez had not taken it as a joke. She could see the respect in his eyes now, and wondered idly if all his bruises had healed. Flame touched oil, and the rag burst to life. She drew and released in one smooth motion, green feathers from the fletching brushing her cheek as they passed. Shouting began from inside the city walls as the barricade that had been meant to kill began to burn harmlessly. She drew again. The men in the towers fell just as easily as she had thought they would. Ekinroy grunted as he and 3 other men shoved the large boulder up out of its hole, over the slight hump, and into the waiting groove, revealing a dark opening in the base of the cliff. Some of the vines that had hid the roughly round rock had attached themselves, bringing down a shower of dirt as they tore loose from the cliff face. One of the men, a recent recruit named Tevin, let out a small shriek and dove away with his arms held protectively above his head. "Did you think the mountain was coming down on you?" His older brother, Hef, laughed when the dirt stopped. "Shut your mouth," Tevin retorted. "I saw you jump too." "Both of you shut up," Ekinroy warned. "The last time I was in these caves, our queen died. Show some respect." He did not mean to be so harsh with the boys, but the thought of entering the caves brought back very, very bad memories. "Boys," he admonished himself with a grunt. Both Tevin and Hef were nearly 30. Hef had served his kingdom under Torvin for a decade. Sometimes he felt much older than his own 40 years. The gray just beginning to spread at his temples told the tale of a lifetime of battles and deeds that any sane man would have tried to avoid. Neither of the brothers had been afflicted by the mass illusion, so it was difficult for them to grasp what they were up against. The third man, Croder, had been. He had not so much as flinched when the dirt fell. His eyes were framed by dark circles, and he held himself as though expecting to kill, or be killed, at any moment, and not be too put out by either outcome. Ekinroy shifted in Tevius's armor, trying to get comfortable as he called for a torch. One of the 100 soldiers standing beneath the canopy of trees north of the city stepped forward and presented him with one, unlit so as not to draw attention from any watching eyes that might happen to look down from the castle high above. Tevius was the same height as he was, and nearly as broad in the shoulders, but the man was decidedly slimmer, and his armor constricted the ribs in an annoying way. Ekinroy's own armor, polished until it shone, had looked quite satisfactory on the young captain for his purpose. So long as that simpleton Balgraz believed that it was him pacing back and forth outside the city, it was well worth a little discomfort. Castle Crysin would belong to Ekinroy and his men before that idiot even knew that anything was amiss, if the way ahead was clear, that was. Unfortunately, his plan depended very much on that one most crucial detail. "Time to find out if we came all this way for nothing." Turning, he addressed the waiting soldiers. "Remember," he called, low enough that his voice did not project beyond the clearing. "Groups of 5, 1 torch per group. You only speak if it's a matter of life or death. The group behind us will do exactly as we do. The next group will do exactly the same, all the way down the line. If we come out of these thought-forsaken tunnels alive, we should be in the chapel. Once the building is secure, those of you with Captain Certez will secure the gate, while those of you with me will take the keep." Certez grinned wickedly, his one good eye as dark as the patch over the other in the afternoon shadows. "I can't wait to see the look on old Balgraz's face when he realizes he has lost the castle. I would rather see the look on Merk's face when he finds out that his pet dog lost all of Eriden to a force that suddenly appeared from the woods and somehow managed to take the castle without even attacking the city gates. That I would pay to see." Striking flint to steel, he blew on the glowing spark that landed on the oil-soaked torch. The spark flared brightly for a moment, and then the torch came alive with a low whoosh. Fire always made him think of his old friend these days. Eriden was with the thoughts now, yet somehow at that moment he could not help but feel that the king was still there, watching over them from the castle above. Twice he had failed the Ryanthorn family he was sworn to protect. Not only should he have been there to stop the wizard from putting a knife in his friend's back, but it should have been him who had died in the cave-in, so that Queen Jocelyn could live. Since he had been robbed of the honor of sacrificing his life for them, getting the throne back for Jaden was his only chance to make some sort of amends. Torch now lit, Ekinroy led the way deeper into the dark opening that had once led up through the mountain and into the royal chapel, with his usual disregard for ceremony. There was no reason to think that the tunnels on this side of the mountain had suffered the same structural damage as those on the other side, which had been besieged by Grislin's unnatural exploding projectiles. But still he knew that most men would probably have never set foot beneath the castle again after witnessing what he had in those other tunnels. Most men would have been frightened at the prospect of ever going below ground again. Fear, however, was problematic for a man who made a habit of risking his life on a near-daily basis, so he had never had much use for it. Balgraz, Norden Merk's right hand, clenched the fingers of his own right hand in a tight fist, as black smoke continued to rise from the ruined trap that he had meant to spring on the enemy. His men must have been spotted dousing the makeshift blockade, even though he had given them strict orders to be discreet. Pain shot up his arm from his little finger and the one next to it, both crushed the previous evening beneath the hoof of a powerful black warhorse. The cursed nuisance of a man who had caused the crushing was out there even now preparing to take back Eriden by force, but he was not going to get it without a fight.
"The thoughts be damned,"
Balgraz cursed, as the last lookout tumbled limply from the nearest tower to land with a thud less than a dozen feet away. The shaft of a Crysinian arrow protruded from the direct center of the man's chest, its fletching comprised of green feathers that shimmered even in the dim overcast glow of late afternoon. Everyone knew that fletching was made from black crow's feathers, because crows were the most abundant bird in all Norda. Who would go to the trouble of using green feathers? And why? Where did one even find green feathers? For some reason, the bright color irritated him. Striding forward, he ripped the arrow from the unlucky soldier, who gave a last gasp before lying still again. Apparently, Herman had not been completely dead. Or was it Harvan? Whatever the man's name, he was most certainly dead now. Snapping the slender shaft over his knee in annoyance, he turned to the milling crowd of unshaven faces behind him.
"So the bastards can reach the towers," he bellowed. "It changes nothing."
It had been a point of contention since the enemy troops had arrived a few hours earlier. Unfortunately, he had been one of those who were adamant that they could not.
"There are extra shields in the barracks. I want 3 men with shields in every tower as lookouts, and 16 ready to man each of the walls at the first sign of forward movement. As planned. If you can't sort out who the lookouts are, your thought-forsaken selves, the men I choose don't get shields."
They had rehearsed taking position along the 4 gate walls enough that the men should not trip over themselves on their way up the towers, and 16 crossbowmen atop each wall would leave enough space for them to maneuver so they could fire their own armor-piercing bolts with lethal effectiveness when the general finally decided to attack. Corpses with proper black-feathered shafts would quickly pile up outside the gates when that time came. With each gate the enemy breached, more and more casualties would mount as Balgraz's men slaughtered them from above. With any luck, Merk would arrive to find what remained of this thought-forsaken sneaky force from Mora, trapped between himself and mound after mound of their own Crysinian dead. If Ekinroy was foolish enough to keep losing men until he was all the way through the meat grinder, when they emerged into the city, they would find that Balgraz and the rest of his men had retreated and were holed up nice and cozy in Crysin Castle. The height of the walls and the steep slope of the ramp up to the massive gate would prove suicide to any army not assisted by strong magic, as theirs had been when they took the castle in the first place. Let Ekinroy and his glorified lumberjacks from Mora try to breach that wall with crossbow bolts whistling down at them. That the thought-cursed man seemed content to waste his time before attacking, strutting back and forth in his fancy armor as if to rub it in that he had more men than Balgraz did, was fine too. If the fool wanted to wear his boots out, let him. Norden had enough men with him to scatter these pests back into the bloody forest they had crawled out of, if that's how they wanted it, and at the current rate, his master might arrive in plenty of time to do just that. That golden-haired whelp with the crazy eyes and his band of cavalry may have eliminated the runners he had sent, but he was certain that the small force he had snuck down river had escaped detection. In truth, the single riders on horseback had mostly been decoys to draw attention away from the camouflaged raft, though the decoys themselves had not been told that. If they had, they never would have agreed to go. One drawback to commanding mercenaries was that they were extremely unwilling to give their lives for the good of their comrades. Balgraz could usually find a way around that, though. What Ekinroy had in reputation, strategy, and soldiers loyal to his cause, he knew he more than made up for in cunning and ruthlessness. And he was not such a bad tactician himself.
Yes, let the self-righteous fool strut, and see where it gets him. Merc's enchanted sword will be in his belly by nightfall. Or maybe the wizard will return, and burn him with his white fire, like he did so many of his thought-blasted countrymen.
He grunted in satisfaction as his orders were carried out, and soldiers with thick shields rushed to man all 8 of the now empty towers. Personally, he would have preferred to have his bowmen already in place, but Udgar had pointed out that the Crysinians could just stand out of range and slowly pick them off, so there was really no point in manning the walls until they moved closer. Those damned Crysinian longbows were proving to be a nuisance. Balgraz had procured a stash of his own from the plundered city, but the blasted things apparently took years to master, and none of his men had shown anything close to proficiency with them. Outnumbered as they were, sending men up on the walls to be used as target practice was not in his best interest at this time, tactical advantage or not. As if just thinking of the weathered old bastard had alerted him, Udgar harumphed loudly. If Norden himself had not commanded that he listen to the old man's advice on all tactical decisions, he would have nailed the presumptuous fellow's tongue to a post a month ago, or perhaps hung him from the castle wall by his manhood. Now that would have served as a nice little reminder of what happened to those who disagreed with him in public. Grudgingly, he did have to admit that the old curmudgeon had a head for strategy to go along with his many years of battle experience. But did he have to be so obnoxiously smugly right about everything? Udgar, of course, had been the most vocal of those who thought the Crysinians could reach the towers from where they were with their longbows.
"I know,"
he snapped as he turned to face the man.
"You told me so."
Dealing with the veteran made him long for a stiff drink. Spitting tobacco from between what crooked yellow teeth he still possessed, Udgar regarded him with a frown. His gray hair and the deep wrinkles at the corners of his eyes made him stand out among the other mercenaries. It was rare that anyone lived to be his age in their profession, and it seemed to garner a great deal of respect from the men.
"Course I did,"
Udgar sniffed.
"That's what I'm here for. But what's done is done. What I want to know is what you propose to do about the other problem."
Balgraz had never understood how age could elicit respect of any kind. Respect was gained through fear, and that was just the way it was. He himself was twice the size of most men, so Merc put him in charge. Men did what he told them, or he beat them senseless. That was the very foundation of respect. Anything else just confused the issue.
"Well, out with it. Or do you intend to make me guess what you are blathering about?"
"The bell. Or did you not notice that they fired the barricades and killed our lookouts as soon as it rang? Like it was some kind of signal?"
"Eriden probably just wanted to see if the damned thing still worked,"
he responded without conviction. Why had Eriden rang that blasted bell? Maybe they had spotted Merc approaching from the castle and were warning them that the enemy forces were about to get desperate and begin the siege. The lookouts in the towers would have a better view of that, though, and none of them were shouting. He had placed Eriden in charge of the defenses at the castle because he was another who liked to question what he was told, and one could only tolerate so much of that. There had been no reason to set up a warning system because there was no way anyone could attack the castle without going through the city, and they still held both of the gates, so it couldn't mean trouble. Or could it? Udgar had him second-guessing himself, and his tolerance for that sort of thing was small at the best of times. He should have left Udgar back at the castle, too. If he needed to use another decoy, he decided, he knew who would be first on the list. Merc did not need to know the specifics of how the old man had died, of course. His commander had always made a habit of knowing things he shouldn't, though, and who knew what that floating, flame-hurling wizard was capable of? Some said the Brotherhood could read minds. Udgar just stared at him, as though guessing something of what he was thinking. The old man's glare was so disrespectful. Suddenly, a less permanent, but also less potentially hazardous, solution than having the man killed occurred to him.
"Oh, very well,"
he sighed in mock resignation.
"I suppose we should send someone up there to ask Lurden what in the blasted netherworld he was thinking. Let me see. We need all of the young men here, in case we ever get around to fighting, and it has to be someone well-respected to put Lurden in his place if need be."
He pretended to consider for a moment, before allowing his eyes to light up with a mock glow at the idea.
"As much as I will miss your charming smile, the sweet scent of your leaf-begotten breath, and the dulcet tone of your voice constantly chirping in my ear, you are the one who is concerned about the matter, so I suppose you should be the one to investigate. The battle plan is set, so your wisdom is no longer required down here anyway. Grab a horse."
A small weight began to lift from his shoulders at the thought of the old man's departure. Udgar glared back defiantly for a moment, then moved toward a swift-looking brown tied outside of the eastern barracks, muttering under his breath as he went.
"Not that one,"
Balgraz chided. Horses were assigned rather than owned in Merc's army, unless you were Balgraz or Merc himself.
"We will need the swiftest horses to get us to the castle if the invaders happen to break through in your absence. That old gray mare at the end will suit your purpose. Hey, her coat matches your beard."
He smiled at the hate in Udgar's eyes. This was fun. Even as the wrinkled, gray-haired veteran untied and mounted the mare with a spryness that belied his appearance, the sound of galloping hooves sprang up from the large square to the west that had once bustled with self-important Crysinians. Everyone turned to view the approaching rider, then parted to let him pass. Balgraz eyed the new arrival with surprise. It was Keeld, one of his favorite drinking companions, who he had tasked with keeping an eye on Lurden up at the castle. His surprise turned to alarm when he took in the man's condition. Keeld pulled the spotted gelding to a lurching halt and slid from the saddle, catching himself from falling only by a firm grip on the pommel. His breathing was ragged, and he was bleeding from about a half a dozen places.
"What is it?"
Balgraz demanded. His men were always at each other's throats. He made sure of that. It kept them from thinking about other things, like why they weren't given more gold or allowed to own horses. But this was another matter entirely. They knew that a hostile force had arrived, so why would they turn their anger on each other now of all times?
"The enemy,"
breathed Keeld.
"in the castle."
Balgraz's eyes widened in shock.
"That's impossible."
The blood beginning to pool on the pavestones beneath the man told a different story, however.
"How many?"
"No one knows. It happened so fast. They spilled from the cathedral and—"
His legs gave way and he fell to his knees. Balgraz grabbed him by the front of his uniform to try and pull him back to his feet, but the man had gone limp. He slung the bloody soldier aside with a curse. Now he knew, with a sickening realization, why Ekinroy was holding back from attacking. Somehow, he had managed to sneak some of his men into the castle. How was not as important at the moment as why. He had to think quickly. If the general expected him to abandon the city and make a rush for the castle, he had another thing coming. But he also knew that he could not have the castle closed off to them, since it was their best refuge if things went poorly at the gates. It could not be a large force up there, he reasoned, or they would have been detected on approach. 500 could do as well as 800 down here, he supposed. Having enough crossbowmen to replace those who fell and keep a steady rain of bolts flying was what really mattered. Udgar harumphed from atop the ugly mare, and Balgraz rolled his eyes back in his head. If he heard that sound one more time, so help him, he was going to murder the man. Tevius lowered the bronze spyglass that Ekinroy was known to keep on his person at all times. It was a replacement from Mora, of course, his old one being lost somewhere in his time under Grislin's illusion, but the differences between them were minimal. It was an honor to be entrusted with the care of the delicate instrument, and he hoped it had helped with the disguise. The smaller host of mercenaries who had split from the larger at the east gate, a force of about 300, had reached the base of the ramp. At the top of the ramp, the massive castle gates had been pulled wide open, and there appeared to be fighting on the walls. Ekinroy and his small band were in danger of being overrun if they did not quickly gain control of those gates. But his orders had been clear. Unless the east gate was completely abandoned, Tevius was not to attack. The general had not only suspected that Balgraz would split his forces, he had counted on it. As always, the mighty dragon-slayer had been right. This time, however, Tevius took no joy in the brilliant strategy of Crysin's savior. The enemy's blunder had robbed him of fighting at the great man's side. Frustrated, he waved back the twin lines of riders who had begun to creep up through the ranks of the cavalry, a massive tree trunk supported between them by an intricate system of leather harnesses. If he gave the order, he was sure they could breach the east gate with only moderate casualties. He sighed in resignation. "Lower the rams and rest those horses," he cried. "Archers, advance 20 paces." Though they had been commanded not to attack the gates directly, they were about to make life very hectic for those who had stayed behind to defend it. Irnorians had never shown a proper respect for the power of the Crysinian longbow. Balgraz did not slow his horse as he reached the base of the ramp, instead spurring the stallion on up the incline, with nearly 300 of his mercenaries nipping at his heels. Losing the castle was not an option. Metal rang on metal above them, the occasional spark flying out from the wall to die as it fell toward the ramp that ran parallel to the foundations below. Up they raced. They were halfway to the top now, and still the gate was tantalizingly open to them. Cresting the rise onto the landing before the gate itself, he shouted in triumph and kicked his heels into the sides of the beast as hard as he could. They were going to make it. As he neared the twin slabs of thick banded wood, they swiftly moved inward with a groan, slamming into place with an emphatic boom. He heard the heavy bar drop into place even as he rammed the shoulder of the battle-trained stallion futilely into the center of the gate. The wood barely budged, though the blow staggered his mount, and it was all he could do to keep both of them upright.
"No!"
he screamed, following the cry of defeat with a stream of particularly nasty curses. The uneven clatter of hooves coming to a halt on stone rang out as the men who had managed to keep up pulled their own mounts up short around him. After that, the lesser sound of heavy breathing, from men and horses alike, dominated the mildly cool afternoon air.
"Open the bloody gates, you thought-forsaken whoresons!" he shouted.
A figure above leaned out over the wall. It was Eriden. Balgraz breathed a sigh of relief. For a moment, he had been sure that the enemy had somehow managed to gain control of the castle, as impossible as it seemed. Something wasn't right. Eriden, the man who had been charged with controlling the castle, stared vacantly. Blood began to flow from his mouth, and he toppled limply to the stones below. The men in his path cursed as they maneuvered their mounts out of the way of the plummeting corpse. The next man who emerged atop the wall caused a tingle of anxiety to creep up his spine. Balgraz recognized the one-eyed warrior from the split. His name was Certez, a captain of the Crysinian forces. Before he could open his mouth to curse, a second familiar face emerged and completely stole the breath from his lungs. General Ekinroy Carthaginian himself looked down, studying him intently. But if Ekinroy was on the wall, then who? His heart sank as he realized that he had been duped. His attention had been so focused on the man he thought was the general that he had left the castle practically defenseless. Of course Ekinroy knew a hidden way in. The castle had been his home. There was no air of triumph or gloating about the big man, just curiosity as his eyes moved left to right, counting the men on the ramp. The stern-faced general made a gesture with his hand, and soldiers with longbows appeared on either side of him. There were not too many of them, less than 30, but he and his mercenaries were completely exposed on the ramp. Gathering his wits, he did the only logical thing he could think to do.
"Back to the east gate!"
he cried.
"Retreat!"
A shower of arrows whistled through the air, picking men off like sitting ducks as they attempted to turn their horses in a crowd. Crashing wildly through the ranks of his own men, Balgraz made his way awkwardly back down the ramp. Unfortunately, he had the furthest to go. Men he had drank with, diced with, fought with, called out all around him as they died. Most fell to arrows, but others toppled screaming from the edge of the escarpment to tumble down the steep slope and land brokenly on the rocks that lined the backs of the buildings below. Horses screamed too as they tumbled to their deaths alongside their riders. Balgraz tried not to listen to the dying cries as he continued to bull his way through the throng, concerned only for himself. Sharp pain blossomed in his thigh, and his horse reared. He should have been flung backwards, but the arrow had passed all the way through and stuck in the back of his mount, effectively pinning him in place. Shockwaves of pain shot up through his body as his horse came back down with a jolt. Clinging on to the beast for dear life, the jostling continued until the crowd began to thin as he reached the bottom of the ramp. He managed a quick,
"Rally to the gates!"
before breathlessly bending forward and urging his mount on, away from the deadly shafts. Before he realized that he had reached it, he was galloping through the wide-open space of the massive square in the center of Eriden, the lane to the east gate quickly approaching. None of the men he had left to hold back the main enemy force were in sight, meaning that at least no one had retreated yet. As he grew closer, though, a small group burst into view, fleeing for the safety of the inner city. They pulled up short when they saw him. As badly as he wanted to berate them for abandoning their posts, he ignored them for now and sped past to see what had transpired in his absence. The sight that met his eyes as he drew close to the river caused him to rein in his mount. The archers on the walls and in the towers were mostly dead, along with scattered groups or solitary figures that lie motionless in the street. Those who were left from the original 500 were crammed into the barracks on either side, taking shelter from the hail of arrows that continued to fall in waves. He had never seen so many damned arrows. Anywhere without a roof was a field of indiscriminate death.
"Fall back!"
he yelled angrily. Ekinroy mercenaries began to file out of the barracks, keeping one wary eye to the sky. Worried faces regained a small measure of confidence at the sight of him, despite his obviously wounded leg. He waited until they had all gathered around him in a half-circle.
"Who's got some bloody rum?"
he shouted. No one stirred at first. Then a hand thrust a half-full bottle up at him. He snatched it, not bothering to notice who had proffered it. Strictly speaking, they were not supposed to have alcohol on the field of battle. But, strictly speaking, he was glad someone had flaunted that stupid rule. Balgraz chugged the contents, then tossed the empty bottle to shatter against a nearby building. Clenching his jaw, he grabbed hold of the shaft sticking out of his leg and snapped it off with a curse. Then he raised his leg up and to the side, effectively removing the shaft, though the barbed tip was still embedded in his mount. The beast would probably die if the arrow was left to fester in the wound, but he had more pressing concerns. Someone could dig the tip out, dress the wound, and save the stupid animal later, once Ekinroy had been dealt with. Some of the men stared at him in wordless awe.
"Squeamish as virgin milkmaids,"
he thought. He'd had worse. Maybe 100 dead at the east gate, he estimated quickly, and probably 50 or so lost at the castle, not counting the men who had been holding the castle proper, without a single Crysinian casualty that he had seen. Ekinroy, the famed general, had struck the first blow, but the fight was not over by a long shot. If Balgraz had his way, and he usually did in the end, it was about to get very nasty for the enemy. They would have to pry him and his men from this thought-forsaken shell of a city, and that would take time that the Crysinians did not have. Balgraz had, of course, scouted the city thoroughly and chosen an area to retreat to in case of an emergency, though he never thought they would need to use it. The thoroughfare between the theater district and the harbor district that led to the west gate was a long one, with a sharp bend in the middle perfect for a small force to stand against a larger one. Upper-story windows would provide cover for the crossbowmen he had left, and debris could be piled to turn the street into a thick bottleneck with poor sightlines for anyone coming from the east. The sun would soon set, adding to the advantage of the location. Those confounded Crysinian longbows would be much less effective in close quarters, and when their wielders couldn't see what they were aiming at. This battle was about to turn from a rout into a bloody standoff. which favored the Ernori in the long run. He sent a runner on horse to inform his commander at the west gate of the planned retreat, then gave the order, and he and his mercenaries from the east gate quickly made their way to their pre-designated stations. The damned chapel bell rang out clearly again as they departed, likely a signal to the force outside the city that the east gate had been cleared and was theirs for the taking. There was no help for it now. Those longbows had done their work well. Most of the men, including himself, had been trained as spearmen in the Iron Legion before signing on with Merck's rogue unit. They were nearly unbeatable in close quarters, and he would use their training to his advantage. With spears or short swords and shields, they would form an unbreakable knot in the center of the road, rotating men to keep them fresh for as long as they needed. The men he already had protecting the west gate could guard their rear. They could slowly give ground for days if need be, before making a break for it and regrouping in the forest to the west if they absolutely had to. Merck and the wizard would have to understand that he had done his best to hold the city with what he was given, outnumbered as he was, and not skewer him or burn him to a crisp. At least, that was the best he could hope for at this point. Moans from the wounded echoed off the empty buildings as those who did not need to be carried limped down the street. It was a disheartening sound. When an Ernori spearman was in training, they were beaten for showing such weakness. His leg was on fire, but you didn't hear him carrying on like a whipped dog. He wished he could whip some of them now, but experienced mercenaries required a more tactful approach if you wanted to maintain their loyalty. Coin was the greatest motivator, of course, but every wise mercenary knew that coin was only good so long as you were still around to spend it.
"Hang in there, men,"
he shouted. Forcing a smile, he slowed his pace and turned his horse to face the stragglers.
"They had their fun, but now we'll show these soft forest-dwelling Westerners what it means to face a phalanx of Ernori warriors when they can't hide behind those fancy bows their wives carved for them."
A few of the men cheered, and still more nodded in agreement, but many looked stunned by the events that had transpired. It had been a long time since most of them had known even so small a defeat as they had just witnessed. Balgraz sighed inwardly. Pep talks had never been his specialty, but they needed more.
"When Merck shows up and takes the general's head, I say we play a game of kickball with it right in the middle of that big square."
That brought a spattering of laughter, but not as much as he had hoped for.
"A bag of gold to the man who scores the first goal."
More of them did seem to perk up at that. He wished, not for the first time, that he didn't always have to resort to promising more gold to raise their spirits. One man cleared his throat as they rounded the bend and arrived at the spot where they would make their stand.
"Yes, Udgar?"
he replied with manufactured patience. Udgar spit tobacco, as he always did before saying something particularly annoying.
"While I agree that a stand here makes sense if Mark is on his way, there is no guarantee that he actually is on his way. The west gate is accessible now, but it may not remain so for long."
Balgraz glared daggers at him.
"Get off that horse,"
he commanded. Udgar complied, but snorted with contempt as he did so. Balgraz dismounted himself, with only a little grimace. He was going to have to wrap that leg before the battle began, and approached the old man. Reaching out one enormous hairy hand, the one on which all his fingers still worked properly, he took the gnarled fellow by the throat and squeezed. Udgar's eyes bulged, and he began to thrash, clawing futilely at his assailant.
"If you're so bloody wise,"
he chided as he added more pressure,
"then why didn't you see this coming?"
The man reached for his sword, but Balgraz grabbed the pommel with his other hand and held it firmly in its sheath. The thrashing continued for another 10 seconds or so. They always took so long to die this way. Then abruptly stopped. He let the body fall to the street. This time he did not have to force himself to smile.
"How bad can wizards' fire be?"
he thought.
"Pile anything you can find on either side of the street, but leave an opening 4 men wide in the center. Anyone who still has a crossbow, find a window with a good view of the street. Anyone not in the first phalanx, help the wounded and the rest. When I need you, I'll call for you. Here is where we make our stand."
The well-trained mercenaries complied quickly. their looks saying that they were as much afraid of him as of the Crysinians now. That would do fine. Fear, gold, what did it really matter so long as they obeyed? Udgar's shirt made a nice wrap for his leg, as well as a good warning to anyone else who thought about second-guessing him or deserting, and within minutes he found himself standing in the center of the street, surrounded by the group of sturdy professional soldiers who would withstand the first assault with him. The shield and short sword, short for him anyway, felt like old familiar friends in his steady grasp. His crossbowmen were in place, ready to return the favor that Mora's archers had granted them. The wounded were being tended to, and replacements were getting some needed rest so they would be fresh when he called on them. This was more like it. No more tricks, no more games. A fair fight in close quarters. This is what he was good at, what he was made for. It did not take long for the Crysinians to arrive. They heard the clack of horses' hooves on pavestones before they saw them. Riders in the green and brown of the eastern province filling the street with a sea of westerner faces. They stopped in unison at a signal from the lone figure at their head. Ekinroy dismounted, handed his reins to the man in shining armor who Balgras had mistaken for Ekinroy, but had been that crazy-eyed youngling all along, and stepped forward a few paces. His demeanor was casual, showing not the slightest bit of hurry.
"Balgras,"
he called.
"come out here, big fellow. I can tell it's you hiding behind that shield." "Hard to miss, isn't he?"
the one-eyed Certez added jovially. There was a scattering of laughter from those at the front of the host, but Ekinroy quelled it with a glance. Certain that the comment had been aimed at his girth, he briefly imagined what the one-eyed man's good eye would look like popping from its socket. Refusing to limp or show any sign of weariness, Balgras set his shield aside and obliged the general's request. There was no fear that the honorable man, curse him, would ever attack during parley. That was just not how the fool did things.
"I'm here,"
he called back, stopping just beyond the barricade.
"Have you come to talk or die? I'm afraid I'm all out of other options for you. We could share a drink, I suppose, and wait for Merc or your old friend Grisland to come kill you."
"How's the hand?"
the general asked, mock concern displayed on his brow. He had not realized that he was working his fingers on that hand, attempting to get some feeling back into them. The man did not miss a thing. Before he could answer, Ekinroy looked beyond him and called out,
"I grant safe passage to anyone who wishes to exit the city through the west gate. All I ask is that you leave Crysin, never to return. That goes for the crossbowmen in the windows as well."
Of course he knew where the damned crossbowmen would be.
"These are my men. They follow my orders."
"Then order them to go now, or I will kill the crossbowmen."
"Not even those longbows of yours can shoot through walls."
"I have always abhorred unnecessary slaughter,"
said the general. Then he put his fingers to his lips and gave a loud whistle. There were brief sounds of struggling from inside the buildings, and then Balgras's crossbowmen began to fall from the upper stories to land on the street in a series of sickening thuds.
"How? Did you think you could only sneak men out through the harbor?"
interrupted Ekinroy. With a sinking feeling, Balgras realized that the camouflaged raft had fooled no one, which meant that Merc likely still had no idea that Eriden had been assaulted. This had been the general's endgame all along. Take the castle, drive them from the east gate with barrage after barrage of arrows, and have the men who sneaked in through the harbor waiting in the most obvious spot for the mercenaries to retreat so they could neutralize his crossbowmen. They had been herded like sheep right into their own pen. He looked from window to window and saw that where familiar faces had once stared back, waiting for his signal to rain death down on the enemy, there were now men in green and brown, holding those miserable, cursed, thought-damned longbows. The general really was the genius that his reputation made him out to be. If he had not wanted to see the man's lifeless head on a pike so badly, he might have even told him so.
"We're still not going anywhere,"
Balgras growled defiantly.
"The offer is for them, not you,"
Ekinroy said with that infuriating calmness.
"You I challenge man to man in single combat. You will face me here and now, or all will hear of your cowardice."
Drawing a massive broadsword, one of the most feared mortals in all of Alnorda stood patiently waiting for his reply. There was a rustle from somewhere back behind the barricade. Turning, he saw a group of his leather-clad soldiers arguing over a horse.
"You men, fall back in rank."
They ignored him. Then more began to break from the phalanx to join them. Men started exiting the buildings next, and heading west. Some scrambled for horses, and some simply began walking down the street toward the west gate.
"Stop, you cowards!"
he ordered.
"I will have the head of every man who deserts."
Still, no one paid him any heed. Half of his force seemed to be leaving, maybe more. He stared in disbelief.
Mercenaries.
But wasn't he a mercenary too? He knew exactly how much coin was worth to the dead.
"Very well,"
he said, then began walking back through the barricade and the milling soldiers.
"Just let me grab my—"
Reaching up, he yanked a man from atop the horse the fellow had just mounted, jumping up in his place with surprising speed for a wounded man his size. The situation had changed, and desperate measures were called for.
"Yeah!"
Whipping the reins and digging his heels into the side of the confused Brown, he sped off toward the west gate himself, heedless of anyone who did not move out of his path fast enough. What would Merc say? Would the wizard be with him? He decided that he did not care to find out. He had never been to the frozen north, but it suddenly sounded like a nice enough place. It should be no problem to steal a boat in western Crysin and bully some of the locals into crewing for him. Then he could head up the coast and live happily ever after with the dwarf wife. He had never been one of those fools who begrudged a woman a little naturally grown hair on her face. The west gate could not approach fast enough. Upon seeing their fearless leader flee past as though his hair was on fire, the remaining mercenaries did likewise. Ekinroy and the front ranks of the force from Mora gave pursuit to hurry the fleeing soldiers along, but did not engage them. He had meant what he said. So long as they left Crysin, he did not care where they went to sell their services. They paused a little way past the hastily constructed rubbish piles, where they could just see the west gate in the distance and watch the invaders depart. Balgraz was still visible, his big form bobbing along as his horse outran most of the others.
"It's a shame we could not have taken that one alive,"
Certez remarked to Ekinroy.
"He may know something of his master's plans, or the whereabouts of the wizard."
Sidra casually unlimbered her bow. "Shall I wing him?" Certez raised an eyebrow.
"I know she's good, but let's be realistic. No one could hit a moving target at that range."
Ekinroy smiled.
"Care to make a wager? Say, a crown?" "It's your money, sir." "Done."
They watched with great interest as the form of Balgraz continued to shrink. He was over halfway to the gates now. Sidra stepped forward, pulled the string past her ear, held it for a moment, and loosed. A handful of heartbeats later, the figure of the distant rider appeared to stiffen. The horse slowed, and the big man toppled from its back.
"By the thoughts,"
the one-eyed captain grumbled, reaching for his purse.
"That's just unnatural."
"Tevius," the general shouted, and the young man moved his mount closer. "Yes, great one."
"Go back to camp and tell everyone to move inside the city, but keep them in the square until we've had a chance to sweep the streets for stragglers. Once they're settled in, find me and let me know if His Highness is awake yet."
Tevius cast his eyes down doubtfully.
"He will wake. I have gone through far too much trouble the past few days to have him die on me now."
"I believe you, Dragonslayer. You are as much a prophet to us as a warrior." He began to turn his mount.
"Wait."
Ekinroy shot a meaningful stare his way. "Forgive me. It is difficult not to praise your abilities."
"It's not that. It's the sight of you in that armor."
"Yes," Tevius said thoughtfully. "It fits surprisingly well."
"Take it off."
"I was hoping that perhaps now we have taken the city, you could have another set commissioned, and I—"
"Off."